أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. دستور يا سيدي مدد we ask permission and supportation of Maulana Shaykh Adnan to open on our hearts something which will benefit us, what he wants to give us as a medicine for our spiritual sickness, you understand. And so we open the station from what we will do in our house. We will translate for you only as you are listening and listening also. And we say, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the best medicine for everything is to start with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maulana says every problem, every suffering, every sickness, when you say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, means that Allah Almighty will be the one looking after you. If you miss Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, then you will be disconnected with heavens, with the divine presence of Allah Almighty and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and awliya. Only the things which make you to be connected is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, because it contains the greatest name of Allah Almighty. The greatest name of Allah Almighty, which cannot be carried by letters, because Allah Almighty is the Creator, and His greatest name of the Creator also cannot be carried by a created thing. Letters are created, and so the name which Allah Almighty gave it to His essence, to Himself, cannot be carried by letters. And for this Allah Almighty is hiding it in Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, if you want to translate it to English, means by the name. By the name. Which name? By the name which Allah Almighty giving to Himself and make it hidden. By this name, the greatest name of Allah Almighty, which cannot carry by letters, by the name, this hidden name of Allah Almighty. Allah say, if you want to call me by the name of Allah. In that station, the sending of Allah Almighty on the station, ocean of wahdaniyah, of oneness of Allah Almighty, Allah making the name Allah to be the name which is carrying and covering all the divine, the godly words of names and the godly words of attributes of Allah Almighty. And for this can be given the name to be carried by letters. And so He say, by the hidden name, by my greatest name, of my essence, which known to be, call me for you, all creations, as Allah. By Allah call me, enough for you. No need for that name. That name is only can be given to the one who will be the example of lights of Allah Almighty. Allah Almighty saying, I am the light of heavens and earths. Allahu nur as-samawati wal ard. Mathal nur, the example of my light. And Maulana say, Allah cannot be described, and His attributes cannot be described, and His name cannot be described. Everything related to Allah Almighty cannot give a description. And Allah Almighty now is describing, but He is not describing His light. He say, the example of my light. He is describing the example of His light. And so Allah Almighty saying, I used to be a hidden treasure. When my will to be known, I create creation, and by me they know me. And for this Allah Almighty, first, when the will of Allah Almighty to be known, the first to appear from the divine, the godly word of command of the hidden treasure is the divine, the godly word of lights, from which Allah Almighty is appearing all what endorsed in His divinely ocean of eternal knowledge, and making it to appear in this divinely godly world of lights, which he say is my light. But I am appearing everything from the example of my light. This example of my light is existing by my light, by me, but cannot be things appearing directly from my light, then everything will be totally shocked and melted, no more to exist. And so Allah Almighty, when the divinely godly word of light appeared, was appearing in the picture and shape of seed of Prophet Muhammadun Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And for this Allah Almighty saying, you are the ocean of my secrets, of my realities, where I am endorsing all my divinely ocean of knowledge, which is endorsed in them to be appearing from this godly word of light, which is the example of the lights of Allah Almighty. And Allah starts in the ayat in the Holy Quran to describe the example of His light, describing the Holy Prophet Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how Allah Almighty making him and create for him a crystal room, chamber, to be his reality in it, and to be under the eyes of Allah Almighty, needed this door of reality by all these lights coming from the divinely oceans of the eternal knowledge of Allah Almighty to be endorsed in this divinely godly word of lights, which is the example of the light of Allah Almighty. And Allah Almighty was dressing him by all means of the godly, divinely godly word from the eternal forever, were all needed in this door of the reality of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then Allah Almighty called him the first to call him by opening Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You represent my beloved Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, my greatest name, the hidden name. And so when Rasulullah was well needed by the lights from the eyes of Allah Almighty and the hands of Allah Almighty, his reality was completed and dressed by all these lights which are going to appear in the world of witnessing, in the world of the godly deeds of Allah Almighty. Then Rasulullah was saying, oh Allah Almighty, by what I like to make zikrullah, to make zikr for you, by what name I will make zikr? And only for him was given this name, which is not carried by letter, to call, to make zikr by this name for seal of Prophet to Allah Almighty, to the essence of Allah Almighty, because he is the one resembling and the example of the light of the essence of Allah Almighty. And Allah Almighty dressed him to be the Khalif, the representative, the one who represents Allah Almighty in all divinely godly word. And for this Allah saying, Ar-Rahman, the most merciful, Allama al-Quran, he taught the Holy Quran after teaching. To whom he was teaching the Holy Quran, Allah Almighty? Who was the one who was translating this divinely godly knowledge of Allah Almighty to all manifestation and light? Who was the divinely godly tongue of Allah Almighty to translate the divinely oceans of knowledge, godly knowledge, which Allah gives them a name, Holy Quran. These words which was carried by the tongue, by the divinely godly tongue of Allah Almighty, who was translating the revelation, because Allah Almighty was talking to Rasulullah by revelation, from heart to heart, from Allah Almighty to heart of Rasulullah, and Rasulullah translating to all manifestation and to all lights appearing from La ilaha illallah and converting into Muhammadun Rasulullah to appear in the world of witnessing and blessing them by the Holy Quran, by the educating them, teaching them all divinely knowledge from the divinely oceans of Allah Almighty. Until all of them, they were well educated, well dressed by all the divinely teaching and training of Allah Almighty by seal of Prophet. Allah Almighty then, He said, after this teaching, I created man. خلق الإنسان. I created mankind after teaching. And for this, Maulana say, you will never see in the Holy Quran one ayat, Allah saying to Rasulullah, teach them. Never. Always Allah telling in the Holy Quran, ذكر فإن الذكر تنفع المؤمنين. Remember them by the eternal teaching of Allah Almighty through you, my beloved Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Remember them, because remembering them, it will benefit the mu'mins, the believers. And to Allah Almighty, all children of Adam alayhi salam are believers. All of them, they are Muslims. Because when Allah Almighty invite all their soul, all these manifestations were invited, all these rights were invited by Allah Almighty, and saying, whom am I? And all of us, we say, you are our Almighty God, and we are your weakest servant. We announced Islam from three eternal. And for this Allah saying in the Holy Quran, أَسْلَمَ لِلَّهِ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. All heavenly creations, earthly creations, between them, universes, all, they already announced Islam and submitting themselves to Allah Almighty. Only when they were appearing in the godly world of deeds, in this world, everyone was trying to dress by a different cloth, by a different dirtiness, not keeping the promise which they promised to Allah Almighty. And for this Allah Almighty gave them all to Rasulullah pure and clean. And He told them, you are the shepherd for all of them, and you are the imam of all of them. وَكُلَّ شَيْءٍ أَحْصَيْنَاهُ فِي إِمَامٍ مُبِينٍ. Everything Allah Almighty saying in the Holy Quran is well endorsed and well it is addressed by me in this Imam, in my divine presence, which is so clear and appearing like sun, how sun appeared to us, like sun, He was appearing, the God divine, the word of lights of Allah Almighty, the example of the light of Allah Almighty in the divinely presence of Allah Almighty, and Allah saying, Imamun Mubin. He is the Imam, He is the leader, He is the Lord of all these lights and manifestation, of all whatever coming from my divine the oceans of as creation, as manifestation, as light. The Lord of them is my beloved seed of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And for this Rasulullah Maulana said, he said in the hadith, I am the Lord of children of Adam alayhi salam, and no proud. I am not seeing myself, no proud in myself, but this is something given to me by Allah Almighty, which means all proudness from Allah Almighty given to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But Rasulullah was the Imam of humbleness, as Shaitan was the Imam of proudness. Rasulullah was the Imam of humbleness. And for this, the most important teaching is to be always humble. How much you will be humble, how much Allah Almighty will upgrade you and bless you by divine the ocean of realities and secrets. And so between all the Sahaba of Rasulullah, the most humble one was Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And for this, Allah Almighty ordered Rasulullah, whatever I dressed to you, my beloved Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, dress it to the chest of Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, radiallahu anhu, because he was the Imam of humbleness. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam even was the Khalif and the representative, and he was the one crowned by the greatest name of Allah Almighty, which cannot be carried by letters, even though Allah made him to make seclusions for more than 20 years or 22 years from the age of 18. He used every year to go to the cave of Hira, one complete month, 30 days of months of Ramadan, to be up in this cave facing the Kaaba, and used to eat some few dry breads with some olive oil for 30 days every year, to finish all his human existing, all his humanity powers into his spiritual power. So that after 20 or 22 years of seclusion, only was the spiritual powers of Rasulullah appearing. And for this Allah Almighty descending Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam on the age of 40 over Rasulullah, when he was totally completing to finish his humanity, no more to be existing by his humanity, only is existing by the lights of Allah Almighty. Allah Almighty dressed him to be sent, Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam. And Rasulullah, they said in the ulama and the scholars, that when he saw Sayyidina Jibreel the first time and was hugging him and telling him, Iqra, read, Rasulullah was shivering. Never Rasulullah shivering. Rasulullah, he is the one representing the divine, the godly word of Allah Almighty, of realities, of secrets, of lights, of the essence of Allah Almighty. He is the ocean of uniqueness of Allah Almighty. He is the ocean of oneness, wahdaniyah of Allah Almighty. He is not going to be shivered from Sayyidina Jibreel, whom Rasulullah was choosing, Sayyidina Jibreel, to keep the Holy Quran as amana, as a trust, until he will appear in this dunya, in this life. Why he was shivering, Rasulullah? Because when Jibreel descended on him the first time, when he was in the age of 40, he saw the divinely lights of the essence of Allah Almighty behind Jibreel, covering Jibreel alayhi salam, which he used to see it when he was in pre-eternal as a reality in the divine presence of Allah Almighty, and still there. He saw that lights of the essence of Allah Almighty shining and covering over Jibreel alayhi salam, without Sayyidina Jibreel noticing or know about it. And for this Rasulullah was, his physical body so shivering from the appearance of the lights of Allah Almighty, the essence of Allah Almighty covering Jibreel alayhi salam. And like this, the revelation was coming, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the first is to teach the Sahaba humbleness, how to be humble. And the humbleness is to be accepting everything from Allah Almighty and from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not to refuse or to deny or to say why or what or for what like this, what for. There is nothing, not anything like this. Then it will be proudness, because Shaitan was the one to say to Allah Almighty, why I will make sujood to Adam alayhi salam? Why to do sujood? Why to bow for Adam? Why? I am better than him. And this is what Rasulullah was teaching, the first teaching of Rasulullah, not to say why. Only to say, Amanna wa saddaqna. We believe by Allah Almighty and by whatever coming from Allah Almighty. And this humbleness, Allah dress it in Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. how much you will be using Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, how much you will be connecting yourself with the greatest name of Allah Almighty, the hidden name. And this greatest name of Allah Almighty represented by whom? By sealed of Prophet Muhammadun Rasulullah. And for this you will be well connected, and this connection will come that to connect you with the divine presence of Allah Almighty. Then the one who is connected, never he will see suffering in his life, never will see burden in his life, never will see anything facing him to trouble him. He will see everything then that is covered by the light of Allah Almighty and Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and all whatever coming over him is coming through the one who represents Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in every century and period of time. And for this Allah Almighty ordering His beloved Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to keep Siddiqs to day of judgment. Siddiqs to be remaining. As Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq was in the century of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and Rasulullah was saying, I am the city of realities and secrets, and the door of this city is Siddiq. And what Allah Almighty dressed me, ordering me to dress it to the chest of Siddiq, and like this Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq, before he passed away, he dressed it to another Siddiq. And like this, from one Siddiq to another Siddiq, must be in every period of time a Siddiq who represents Rasulullah to connect people in his time with sealed of Prophet. Not only common people, not only the nation or children of Adam, without looking at their religion, but to connect even 124,000 awliya, whom they exist in every period of time with Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Without this, Siddiq cannot be connected with Rasulullah. As Rasulullah, he say, close all doors of the Haram of Medina, keep on the door of Siddiq. And all Sahaba, they are obliged to enter from the door of Siddiq to Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Till day of judgment, on the door of Siddiq. And so must be a Siddiq, a Khalif, successor of Siddiq in every period of time, to connect people with the fathers of Siddiqs, who connect them with Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and Rasulullah connected them with Allah Almighty. And nowadays, the Siddiq of this time, as I was the one writing the will of Grand Shaykh, he said, the Siddiq of this time is my son, Nazim Effendi, Mawlana Shaykh Nazim, Sultan of Awliya, and what Allah dressed me and Rasulullah, I address it to my son, Nazim Effendi. Keep following him, keep yourself with him, follow him, and tell everyone to follow him, and he will be